Hi everyone, welcome to FNC's first pre-med panel. My name is Lamia and I was a student of FNC in 2019. Since I got accepted to Columbia University and I'm currently a senior studying biology on the pre-med track. So like all of you, I also have lots of questions about what it's like to be a doctor and what the journey is like. And today we have 6 wonderful panelists who can talk more about their journey. They're at different stages. We have an attending, we have students in residency, and we have students in medical school. So if you have any questions about the journey, please feel free to add it to the Q&A box, and we'll hopefully answer those questions around the last 20 minutes of the panel. With that being said, let's go ahead and get started. Ben, since you joined first, can you please give us an introduction of yourself and what you're doing, what you're up to?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Ben. I'm currently a second year MD PhD student at Columbia Medical School. Right now I'm in the weird transition between MD and PhD where I'm doing a couple of clinical rotations, and then starting in this fall, I'll start my PhD. I'm doing surgery rotation right now, so I'm very tired.
That's awesome. Darwin, can you please go next?
Yeah, of course. Hi, everybody. My name is Darwin. I'm a first year med student at SUNY Downstate. I did FNC in the summer of 2015, actually. And between college and med school, I took 3 gap years. If you guys have any specific questions relating to that. And yeah, just right now, I'm just enjoying my first year, potentially interested in like emergency medicine.
Kira.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kira. I am currently a fourth year medical student at New York Medical College. I was an FNC TA in 2017, I think, 2017, 2018. And I did a master's, 2-year master's program before I started medical school.
Bed.
Hi, everyone. I was a TA in 2014 for FNC. Then I did a couple years after undergrad doing research before going into med school, and now I'm a resident in otolaryngology.
And last but not least, Sean.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Udell. I'm an attending physician in Park City, Utah, and I'm a psychiatrist. I was a TA for FNC in 2009, which was the first year FNC started. So it's good to see you all.
Yeah, thank you to our panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules to come and speak to us today. We're going to go ahead and start with the first question. How did you know you wanted to pursue medicine? And we'll go backwards this time. So Sean, how did you know you wanted to pursue medicine?
I did not. I had a very winding road to medicine. I was actually a special education teacher before I pivoted to medicine. But in my time working as a special ed teacher, I got to interface with, a lot of different physicians who were specialists for the, kids that I was making education plans for in the classroom, and just started to wonder if this might be a better fit for me for what I like to do about my job. I had not done any of the prerequisites. And so then I first had to figure out like, how would that even work? Took a few years of kind of like soul searching, doing a lot of volunteer work to make sure that this made sense. Made the leap in 2014 to a post-bac program.
Ved?
I think I probably knew I was going to do apply to med school by the time I had become a TA, so around my junior year. But around the time I finally made that decision, the MCAT had changed, so I ended up taking a couple of gap years. But I think what brought me to it was a combination of interest in science, which I had all along, as well as then working with people. And part of what really sealed the deal for me with medicine was my experience with FNC, and sort of pushing me away towards like a career in as a PhD scientist, something more humanistic that kind of combined those interests. So I eventually kind of made the leap towards the end of my senior year and decided I wanted to apply to med school.
Great. Kira?
So I definitely started college with the idea that I was going to apply to medical school afterwards. I think all throughout sort of high school. I was always really into science, and it just sort of self-fulfilling prophecy after that. I did do the master's program just to kind of give me a little bit more of a good application base to go into applying for. But for me, it was definitely sort of all along, it was there, and then every experience I had just sort of reaffirmed that decision.
Darwin?
Yeah, kind of similar to everyone. I remember at the end of FNC, they used to give out these awards, and I think mine was like the Family Man Award, and I still have it with me actually. And I feel like that's a pretty good representation of kind of like the person that I am, like growing up like in a multi-generational household. Yeah, paper plate awards. And growing up in like an immigrant family and just like helping them navigate the healthcare system. I just felt like if my family kind of had like negative situations or experiences in the healthcare system with someone that could advocate for them, that person being me, and there were kind of people who were less fortunate. And I kind of wanted to step in and help bridge like those cultural and linguistic gaps in healthcare while focusing on like community health. So kind of just all led to medicine.
Ben?
Yeah, so I got into medicine through a very, very niche route. I had a really close family friend who was diagnosed with ALS and then passed away by the time I graduated high school. And that got me very like watching that whole process got me really interested in neuroscience. I really didn't have like a direction of interests until then, but I just kind of became fixated on an interest in neurodegenerative science. And my mom's a hairstylist, and she has a longtime client who's an anesthesiologist, and he offered to talk with me about my interests. And randomly one day in talking, he was like, "You know what? It sounds like you're interested in something called an MD PhD." And from then on, I was just kind of set on that idea of like, I can be a scientist and practice medicine, and went into college, did neuroscience major, and have not jumped ship yet.
Ben, you touched on this a little bit. I just wanted to ask the next question, which is, how did you guys find mentors to support you throughout your journey? And how has that helped you gain any clinical or research experience that helps support your decision to pursue medicine?
Yeah, I think I got a little lucky with having a mom who has a lot of people that in just like in the community, like you'd be surprised how many connections hairstylists have. So a little lucky there, but in terms of like the throughout the journey, like during college and such, a lot of the mentors I kind of had to like seek out like in graduate like lab experience and things like that. Like one of the people that really helped me out was he's a physician scientist MD PhD who I worked with in his lab, and really just kind of soliciting his advice in terms of like our specific career paths as MD PhDs and such like that. So a lot of it was through like a lot of experience that a lot of pre-meds do, like working in labs, clinical experience, looking for shadow opportunities, and just trying to keep up those connections with people to build relationships.
Thank you for sharing that. Darwin, what about you?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with what Ben was saying. I think part of it at first it was a really like isolating experience. I went to Hunter College, which has like a huge like pre-med program, and it can be really difficult to feel like you're known or you're established there. So I think part of it was just getting involved on campus. Like I joined I became part of the Latino Medical Student Association e-board, and that was a way for me to kind of get close with my pre-health advisors. So I feel like after that, they really sought after me and put me in touch with people who could benefit me in my future as a physician. And I definitely like always think of like I never want to be the type of person that like kind of burns a bridge, because in the long term like it might be useful. And that's happened a couple of times where like years later, like someone I like occasionally keep in touch with, they reach out to me and they're like, hey, like this opportunity came up, I thought of you, and if it's not for me, like I'll put you in touch with somebody who I think it would benefit for. So kind of paying that forward basically as well.
Right. So what I'm hearing is that networking is very important in the pre-med
In
track.
other words.
Kira?
So I actually really struggled to find mentors during undergrad. I can't think of any that I had that were like really medicine focused for me. And I think that's also part of why I decided to do a master's program before med school. And that's where I really was able to find mentors. Like my PI in the lab that I was working in during grad school was really instrumental in helping me get ready to apply to medical school. And she's still someone who, anytime I need a letter of record or just advice, she'll look over, research projects that I'm submitting for different things. Even though I've moved in a different direction from her lab, she's a great resource. So I would say, like, if you're having a hard time identifying a mentor at first, just don't give up. I mean, just keep going at it, and you'll eventually find someone that you gel with, and who's going to be really supportive of helping you reach your goals.
Yeah, wonderful advice. Ved?
So I will echo a lot of what has been said, but I just want to maybe strike a little different note in saying that there may be a lot of pressure to feel like you need to identify a mentor and have like I will say you don't really need to have someone in medicine per se during college years to mentor you. I think a lot of the biggest factors are things like, your grades, your MCAT score, volunteering and research, and then whatever else you find interesting extracurricularly. So a lot of my mentors were actually like, people like Professor Blake, who wrote me a letter of recommendation, or my molecular bio professor, or my the faculty member who ran the lab I worked in. None of these are medical doctors, but they all, mentored me in some way. But at the same time, it wasn't as if, they necessarily needed to, have a lot of meetings with me about med school and that kind of thing. I think the most important part is just develop relationships with them. They can help write a good letter of recommendation and maybe sort of solidify you in terms of coming to that decision of applying to med school.
Sean?
Yeah, that's all great advice. The only thing I would add to all of that is that, I mean, I agreed, with the idea. I think Darwin was saying that he didn't burn any bridges, which it's always important to never burn bridges. But I also, with mentoring, I think it's important to not necessarily kind of like spin your wheels with someone who isn't necessarily a good fit or isn't doing something that you're terribly interested in. Or that you just kind of feel like you have great rapport with. It's a bit of a dating process in terms of finding the right match in terms of personality, career goals, personal goals. And it's okay to kind of just like let some things kind of sort of drift away into the distance. It's important to not let everything drift away into the distance. Like you do have to kind of like keep the relationship going if it's a relationship that you think is providing you with useful information and helping you like move forward in your goals. But it's also like it is counterproductive to have like a million kind of people that you kind of interface with that aren't really adding much.
Of course. Yeah, my next question is, what steps did you take in undergrad or even during your gap years to figure out and be like the best ideal medical school applicant? We'll go backwards. So like Sean, what steps did you take?
I haphazardly became a good medical school applicant by just doing a lot of extra things. So I think in general it's important to do whatever you're passionate about. Like it really shows if you are like volunteering doing something that you just don't really like that much or aren't that into, and you're just not going to learn it. Like in terms of adult learning theory, like adults really only learn when they do things that they actually are curious about and actually want to learn. So like for me personally, I was curious about emergency medicine, so I did volunteer time there. Eventually was not curious about it because ERs are hellholes if anyone's ever been to one. And then started doing HIV testing and, spent a lot of time in infectious disease. And, so again, like as it's important to kind of curate your mentors, like also important to kind of strike that balance in terms of doing things that you find to be interesting, but also not just feeling obligated to stay doing something for a long period of time out of a sense of obligation. Like it's important to still be really interested in it and feel like you're learning.
Red?
I think, one thing to keep in mind is just the unfortunate reality of, grades being very important for med school. That's the biggest and first hurdle. So, yeah, I would just say to keep that in mind, don't put undue pressure on yourself. Being pre-med is already stressful enough. But that is sort of the first thing you need to check off on your checklist when it comes to, making yourself ready to be a really good med school applicant. Because unfortunately, I think more than half of the applicants don't get accepted to a single med school. And I think that is the first thing that gets people out. And really, I do think part of it comes down to like a mindset. Like I have my friend who's an engineer who's very smart, as smart as I am, but for whatever reason in engineering classes, they're like, oh, pulling a C in engineering physics is like whatever. Everyone does that. You look at the pre-med physics class, it's the same physics that's being taught to both, groups, and everyone is like really clamoring to get an A. So there's these little details that I can speak to later, but really navigating that is tricky and stressful. But I think that is important in college, to aim for a good enough GPA where you're not getting knocked out in that first checkbox.
Thank you for sharing that. Kira?
So kind of to Ved's point, I think especially first and second year of college, I was really just focused mostly on maintaining my grades, and a lot of my, I mean, your pre-med classes are important, but overall your GPA is also important. So you don't want to forget that either. And then once I was pretty comfortable with, my study skills, I joined CUEMS. So I got a lot of volunteering hours. I like over, I don't know, like 1,800 hours volunteering with CAVA by the time I graduated. And then that was also a great way to get my volunteering and some clinical exposure. I also realized that I have no desire to be in the ER ever. I avoid it like the plague. So those were sort of, I think, the two things I focused on. I got involved in research my senior year of college. It was a good learning experience. It didn't end up being super productive for me, as far as having things to put on my CV. But I learned a lot of basic skills that served me really well in grad school when I did other research projects.
So for those of us who don't know, can you briefly describe what COEMS is and what CAVA is and how that might pertain to other colleges around the nation?
Yeah, of course. So CUEMS is a volunteer EMS service at Columbia, but a lot of college campuses around the country have similar organizations. So at least at Columbia, the students who are on it are all EMT certified. So there are opportunities to get certified at school and also through outside organizations. It doesn't matter. You can transfer your certificates between states relatively easily. And so we would just take shifts throughout the week and respond to emergencies in and around campus, and also help with big events like Bacchanal and graduation, and that sort of stuff. So it was a really great way to learn some basic patient care skills ahead of medical school. I was really comfortable doing a history and like a pretty brief physical exam on patients just because it was very routine ahead of time. So that was really great. And I know a lot of other campuses have similar options for students.
Darwin, what steps did you take to become an ideal applicant for medical school?
Yeah, so I guess I didn't consider myself like pre-med until probably like the end of my sophomore year of college. And I think because of that, I knew like I wasn't the type of person to just kind of go straight through. Like I always knew I was going to take at least 2 gap years, and I was kind of mentally prepared for that at that point. Similarly, like I just took the first 2 years of college to get accustomed to my academic life. Like my parents like didn't go to college, for example. Like I had no idea what I was doing truly. But I did know that because of kind of like my upbringing, I was interested in working in like immigrant and population health. So I sort of kept that narrative along the way. Like I've done a lot of community health experiences, immigrant health experiences, very like public health focused. And that's part of like the reason why I want to be a physician to begin with. So the summer programs that I did, I worked as a scribe in the same neighborhood that I was raised in, which is like in Uptown Manhattan, for 2 years during the pandemic. And that's something that I got to speak a lot about like meaningfully during my interview season and all that sort of thing. And it worked in my favor.
What about you, Ben?
Yeah, so I just told you this little story about how I got, came into college like, oh, I'm gonna do an MD PhD. Was interested in something very specific. And I will be totally honest, I didn't actually know what that meant when I got to college. I just said, oh, I'm gonna do an MD PhD. I didn't know what the requirements were. I didn't know anything about the application process. I was a first-gen low-income student. I really came in clueless. And I think I really didn't start acting like a true pre-med until probably my junior year. I got involved in research really late, for what most people consider the MD PhD path to be really late. I didn't start research until my junior year in college. And I think it's part of what I did to like maximize my sort of application, like how I looked on applications and make myself like an ideal applicant, was just like realizing like what I needed to do and like having this sort of like sit down with myself and being like, okay, I didn't know what I was doing for the first 2 years. Where am I lacking and what do I need to do to make up for that? So about junior years when I sat down, I was like, okay, I'm getting into research late. I'm applying into something that is very research heavy. MD PhD applications much more heavily favor research than they do like clinical experience. And I decided to like take off 2 years and do research check job, so that I could like bolster my research experience. But I think other than that, like a point that I want to bring up that because I echo a lot of what everybody said here. It's, you know, grades are important, and getting that clinical experience, especially for MD only applicants, is super important. I worked in not the ED, but over at by Columbia's campus. It used to be called St. Luke's. Now I think it's Morningside. So you know, I did that. But I think one of the things was like just keeping track of your experiences throughout college is super important, because one of the most important parts of your application is like the essays that you write, because that's how they really get to know you. And if you just kind of like keep note of like the patients that you interact with, if you're doing clinical experiences, the like, you know, experiences that you have in classes, the research experiences that are really meaningful to you and can really like show it, like keep just a timeline of like how you developed throughout college and how that development really contributes to your drive to go to med school, to be somebody's caregiver, I think is a really powerful thing that you can put on an application. And honestly, I think that's, besides like, you know, passing like the initial hurdles of like grades and stuff, that's probably like the real true like cornerstone of like an application, is being able to demonstrate something like that. So just keeping a mind, like a just tabs on like your growth and your experiences with people.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We touched a little bit on grades, handling tough pre-med weed out courses, and handling extracurriculars like research and volunteering. With all of that, how did you guys overcome imposter syndrome / burnout, and how did you manage a good work-life balance? Starting with Ben.
I can't really speak for everybody, but I feel like the imposter syndrome never really goes away. It just gets quieter. You just kind of learn. I think especially it's, in my opinion, I think imposter syndrome really peaks during your pre-med time in college, because pre-meds are perfectionists, and pre-med, it feels like it demands perfection. It, I think, dies down a little bit when you get into medical school, because you're now amongst a cohort that's kind of in it together to go through medical training. You've sort of passed the threshold that everybody was trying to get by. I think for me, I personally tried to surround myself with friends who were sort of the same vibe and energy level as me. Be that pre-med friends, or I think importantly, people who are not pre-med, just to give you some respite and some perspective as to like, you know, what it just means to be a non-pre-med human being. I think that can really, really help. It helped me a lot.
Darwin?
Yeah, imposter syndrome, she's still here, but it's okay. It becomes more manageable, like Ben mentioned. I think part of what was difficult for me was that like it it is the case that like a lot of medical students come from more like financially stable backgrounds, and I feel like my upbringing felt disadvantaged, but I also think that it has made me like a very humble person, and that doesn't mean that I can't bring value to the field or my institution. If anything, I think it gives me like perspective which is something I really appreciate. But regarding burnout in pre-med, I was definitely like the study all day, all week type of person, and it was like atrocious. Like looking back at it, like med school is significantly more difficult, I would say, but my study habits are just healthier. Like I get my 8 hours. I do something every weekend with my friend. Like we usually take a break during the weekday. Like we have like a movie night every Tuesday. It's like a routine that we do. Just things to kind of like keep you going, like little wins basically, to just keep that fire in you going. Which you definitely need. And I'm only my first year, so I could only imagine how it turned out for other people on the panel that have already done this.
Thank you for sharing that. Kira?
I definitely really struggled with imposter syndrome in undergrad. Jess was my CC professor. It was probably like pulling teeth to get me to speak in class. Um, I think I have a note on like one of my end of grades. It's like, oh, if you could talk more, that would be nice. But I think at least in undergrad, I surrounded myself with a lot of people who were not pre-med. So I didn't feel like I was constantly comparing myself. It just happened that my friend group wasn't interested in the same things that I was. And then even though a lot of people on CU EMS were also sort of pre-med minded, we all had a pretty like tight bond. So it never really felt so much like competition. So definitely surrounding yourself with people who are going to be supportive and there for you when things are tough. It followed me to medical school. It definitely sort of comes and goes in waves. When I started my clinical rotations, it kind of reared its head. And again, I was like, oh my gosh, I can't say anything on rounds. I don't know anything. And then you sort of get comfortable again. So I think you just have to develop some good self-awareness about, what you're feeling, what's real. Do you actually have knowledge gaps? Or are you just beating yourself up about something? And sort of really checking in with yourself regularly. And I made it a point in medical school to prioritize my, mental health and well-being. So there were just things that I didn't compromise on. Like I had dinner with my family every Tuesday night, and it didn't matter what was going on or if I had tests or anything. That was just something that I did. And it all worked out. So I think just identifying certain places where you can take care of yourself, because in the long run, the extra 20 minutes of cramming something and just staring at your computer screen is probably not getting you anywhere.
Ved?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think the important thing is to surround yourself with people who kind of energize and motivate you and inspire you, because it is stressful, and you can tell yourself a lot of things that aren't actually true, and just know that everyone, maybe they don't feel it now, but at various points in this path will feel like an imposter. My most confident classmates, with a difficult rotation, were suddenly feeling imposter syndrome for the first time. It happens to everyone in this path. So the important thing is to take care of yourself and find your people who can, remind you of that you are definitely good enough.
Of course, yeah. Sean?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know that there's ever a time when you stop having imposter syndrome. And I think letting go of those expectations of yourself is important. I think my main thing that I talk to med students about, and someone said that AMA says 20% of medical residents meet criteria for depression. I mean, I had heard in one of these burnout lectures that 75% of trainees from medical school to the end of residency end up on an SSRI at some point. And so, like, I think that these struggles are just extraordinarily common in med school and pre-med. And there's just one quick story. Like I failed an exam in med school, and this was in July, and I beat myself up for it over 6 months for failing this exam. I thought I was the stupidest person on the planet for having failed, this pediatric shelf exam. And they only let you make up the shelf exams on one day. It was the day before Christmas Eve at my med school, which I wouldn't recommend anyone go to. And so you all showed up, and more than a third of my class was there that day. None of these people had said anything to me about failing their exam. I had definitely shared with plenty of people that I had failed the PEDS exam and thought I was a fucking idiot and was like so down on myself for it. And then I got there and I couldn't believe all these people were there retaking tests, Family Med, got GYN, all these other tests. And I was like, oh, well, I did great on those. Why am I like, I have been so hard on myself. And so like, I think that self-love is really missing in general in the pre-med training. And that was like my aha moment around that. But hopefully, as many of you were earlier in your career, it doesn't take you until like the end of third year to have that aha, because otherwise you're just spending a lot of time just, self-flagellating, and it's not effective.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think being honest with yourself is really the key here, and giving yourself the time and the space to relax and make sure that you're taking care of yourself first before you're attending to your classes. So just one last question before we open it to Q&A. If you could go back and change one thing about your pre-med journey, what would it be and why? And we'll start with Sean.
Well, I might have gone and done my pre-med courses in undergrad, but I think more than anything, like trying to really like work on that self-love, and like in care, because it's just been missing.
Ved.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is, it's a really never-ending journey, because even, I'll talk to attendings, and maybe Sean can speak to this, but it's never not going to be, a little stressful. There's always difficult moments. So really, stop learning to not beat yourself up about every little, minor setback, and sort of developing a mentality of, being kind on yourself and on others, I think is really important. I didn't, embody that for a lot of my way to where I'm at today.
Kira.
So I think that I just didn't know enough going into college, one about college. Neither of my parents had been to college, so I was also winging it. And I had no idea what it was really going to take to apply to med school and get in. I thought that, I was just going to take my prerequisite courses and maybe do some volunteering, and that was like, it was all going to be fine and dandy. And I had classmates whose parents were in medicine or had other family members who seemed to just know a lot more about the entire process. And I don't know exactly what it would have changed for me in terms of the activities that I did and the classes that I took, because, it worked out. But I think that I ended up being a little more anxious later on in the process when I was getting ready to apply, and I needed letters of recommendation because I felt like there were things that I could have done earlier on that would have prepared me more. So if you're sort of on the fence, I would say, just take the time to really know what's coming down the pipe so that you can be prepared for it. And I think then you won't be back on your heels later on.
Darwin.
Yeah, definitely for starters, not doubt myself so much. But also, similar to some of the people here, my parents didn't go to college, so I didn't know like you could do other things outside of like the biology major to apply to medical school. Like that just seemed like my only choice at the time. And I feel like college would have been a little bit more enjoyable if I had kind of like ventured into another major while also taking like kind of like my pre-med requisites. I still ended up doing a philosophy minor, but I think it would have been nice to do it as a major.
Ben.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that I would have done. I mean, much like Darwin and Kira, I was in this kind of same situation where I came in not really knowing. And I think for me, I think to remedy that, I wish I would have just like not been worried about just like asking people questions, just like cold emailing PIs like, hey, can I join your lab? Like I was so nervous about doing that, and that made it so difficult to get a foot in the door. But at the end of the day, like it is absolutely harmless to just shoot out a bunch of those emails and see what sticks. And I think that's part of why it was so slow for me to get involved in the stuff that I needed to get involved in. And then I think the other thing would have been like just taking more classes that were like stuff that I could have gotten interested in. Like computer science is really cool, and I wish I just would have taken like an intro coding class. Just to explore some interests. Because at this point, my PhD is probably going to be like half computational. It would have been so much nicer to understand a little bit more computer science instead of having to like self-teach all later. Just like exploring more interests, I think, because it's easy to get sucked into just being pre-med and then not doing things like a minor in philosophy, or I did do a minor in linguistics, so I did explore that interest. But I think like, it was one thing. I think being a little bit more broad with like just take a class here and there that's just interesting.
I think I also learned that this semester. So I'm taking cinemas of, I'm also a biology major, but I wanted to take some classes that were outside of the STEM field. So this semester I'm taking cinemas of India, and I really love it. I love watching all those movies and having critical discussions about them. So I'm glad that I made that choice, even though it's my last semester. Yeah, so we're just going to open up the floor to Q&A. Does anyone have any questions? Does anyone feel comfortable like unmuting themselves and asking their questions in person? If not, I could just read them off the chat.
I'm kind of curious about the question in the chat. I was just looking for clarification about like, is it what is it that you don't love about medical training and residency? Or I guess what specifically?
Yeah, so what I've like always heard about medical training is like from certain like physicians, they always talk about being overworked, always being kind of like made to like kind of like fear their attending. Um Kind of like, like the power structure there. And like what else should I specify?
No, that's very helpful. I mean, I think it is like definitely true that medicine is extremely hierarchical, and to a certain extent, going into it, I do think that there has to be some level of acceptance that like there are just a lot of sort of like institutional factors around medicine that make it a place that um, you know basically has embedded sort of racism, misogynism, ideas that the oldest person is the smartest person, that like the number of things you have behind your name makes you the smartest person, right? Like these are all kind of deeply ingrained things in medicine that I think like lots of really good people within the field are trying to change. But the bottom line is that it's still very much a field that is relational, that is about like who you know and who can help you get to where you're going. Who is like grades are very subjective, especially once you leave the preclinical area. Like our OBGYN grades, they literally like put our face on a projector and the residents just sort of said how they felt about that med student. Like there was no like kind of like rubric or anything like that that was used to like grade the student. They didn't even use like our shelf, which was kind of crazy. So I do think you have to kind of have that acceptance because like 100% you're going to encounter racism, sexism, homophobia, all sorts of nonsense in medicine, and it's not right. And it's important to challenge it when you can, but like you're not always going to be in a place where it's safe for you to challenge that. And I think it's changing. But it's of everything in medicine that as it relates to change is very slow. And I think it can be a very hard pill to swallow. When you come to the medicine with some background in sort of activism. But yeah, in residency, they just work you to death, which I was excited that Penn residents unionized, and I think that's in general going to be important for the field, but most programs still are not unionized.
Yeah, thank you for answering that, Sean. Promise, you had a question?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Promise. Go to SUNY Newport, and I'm a freshman, and my major is biochemistry. So the question I wanted to ask is for the research. I already applied to some of them, but when do you think is like a good time to participate in research and all of that? When is it like a good time? And I have another question, sorry. And my other question is what is for the clinical shadowing, how does it work and how do you get in or something like that without any like family like relations, something like that? Because well, I'm like first generation student. My mom is like well she works, but like we don't know anyone who is like works in a hospital or something like that. So I'm kind of like nervous on how to like get those clinical experience and shadowing. So how do you like navigate through that?
I think in terms of when to do research, you've already completed your first year. If you feel like you've got a good handle on your classes and academics, then it's a fine time to start your summer of first year. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And getting those opportunities, depending on where you're at, there may be formalized programs for you to apply to, or you can just try cold emailing PIs at the university, or if there's a hospital attached to the university you're at, you can do that. I think a similar thing applies with volunteering and shadowing. I think I just cold emailed people, or asked if the PI of my lab, for example, knew someone. I never went down the route of asking anyone in my family. And then there were formal programs that I could apply to shadow. I think there's nothing wrong with just reaching out to as many people as you can. I don't think anyone. I certainly would never be bothered by having a student wanting to shadow. So I think people are receptive to that.
Yeah, I'll second that. I think that a lot of colleges have like summer like funded summer research programs, and that can be a great with something I wish I would have done, of like getting involved in research early and also getting a stipend for it for the summer. And it's a great way, like if you get matched with a lab through that and it's a lab that you enjoy, you can stick with that lab and get a lot of work done with them, especially if you get involved like early, like after your freshman year, like the summer after your freshman year or something. But other than that, if you have like a pre-med advisors or like interest groups at your school, like that are like pre-med interest groups, sometimes you can get connections with like labs through there and just like see if anybody knows anybody who recommends labs. Um, as for um, as for getting involved in clinical stuff, I think that if you're nearby like a hospital system, a lot of times hospital systems, like especially large ones like in New York, have volunteer like programs. So like the whole Mount Sinai system, if you like go to their website, they have a volunteer page that can explain like that explains like who you can reach out to, what the volunteer program entails, and you can sort of get involved that way. And sort of people like in private practice, that's a lot more like you probably can like would have, like call like cold email them, just like reach out to people, and it's a little bit harder to like know those people. But I think like a hospital system is a good place to at least get started because that's like an established volunteer program. They can like track hours, and then from there you can like kind of branch out and see if anybody that's been involved in that program knows other people that are like in private practice that are willing to like let students shadow them and stuff like that. So that's what I would recommend.
We can move on to our next question. Joy?
Hi, I'm Joy and I'm a high school student. I'm currently taking an IB higher level biology course, and although I really love like learning in the class, I find it really hard to like study for it because it feels like a bunch of memorization and like less like understanding the concepts and like applying it to like real life situations. Um, so do you guys have any study tips to help it feel like less like memorization?
Um, so one thing I will say is, unfortunately, med school, at least in the beginning, is a lot of memorization. A lot of your preclinical stuff is very much, they kind of want to turn you into a walking encyclopedia. And that's not like a lot of people when they get to medical school, they feel like, hey, this is not what I'm here to do. But unfortunately, it's a necessary part of the process because you have to learn a lot of the information, a lot of the algorithms that you then apply later once you get into a clinical setting. And so I think that my main piece of advice to you is to try to do this memorization and this studying in a way that works for you. Um, you know, gamify how you study. If you're really into Flash, if you're a visual person, use things like flashcards. In medical school, there's like a lot of I think even for like studying for like the MCAT and things like that, there's programs or not programs, things like what is it called? I'm blanking on the name of it. The one that does like all of the drugs where it's like paints a picture. Somebody help me out here.
Sketchy or Pixar.
Sketchy, yes. So there's this thing called Sketchy where they'll paint you like a memory palace picture where everything in the picture means something, and that helps you like organize your thoughts by just remembering the picture, and everything means like what this drug does and like what the name of the drug is. And so I think I recommend this to people coming into med school as well. Find ways that really that work for you and how your brain works for a memorizing thing. I think that's the biggest piece of advice, because at the end of the day, you're gonna have to memorize a lot of things, but doing it in the most efficient and funnest way possible is the way to go about it, in my opinion.
I also think that it's kind of the nature of learning biology, and especially when I went to med school, I had a rude awakening where it's a lot of memorization. But I think I liken it to learning a language. Like imagine if you didn't know English and were hoping to discuss philosophy. You got to kind of learn the language and learn the vocabulary before you can start discussing philosophy. So you're gonna have to trudge through the difficulty of memorization, but then on the other side, it's actually really intellectually satisfying. I think this is the sad part of medical education, but as a resident, I love the learning that I do, and the way that I can integrate and apply the concepts that I've spent many hours learning. But as a med student, it was a lot of boring memorization where I couldn't connect the dots and see why this mattered.
There's a question in the chat by Brando. I'm interested in medicine in general. What should I research to gain a sense of what working in the medical industry would be like?
I mean,
Yeah,
it's definitely easier said than done, but this is where I think trying to find those sort of shadowing opportunities is really helpful, because you can definitely like research online. People write like great reflections of their time as a medical student or as a physician or in another position in healthcare. Um, but you kind of should put yourself there before you're really committing to what is years and years of training. Um, a lot of student loans for some of us. You want to be sure that you're actually enjoying the clinical environment and that it's somewhere where you're comfortable or could learn to be comfortable. Because I think there are a lot of people who like it sort of in abstract, and then they walk into a hospital and they're like, oh, wait, I actually don't like it here. And there are a lot of ways to be involved in science and medicine without maybe necessarily doing things clinically. So if you can sort of get your feet wet, that's why I liked being an EMT. Um, that was outside of the hospital, but then we were going in and bringing patients in, and I could hang out in the ER and see what was happening, and sort of follow along with those. So that was really reaffirming to me that I liked being in a clinical environment.
Yeah, I think saying yes to a lot of different experiences is important. But I also think that's part of the point of having a good mentorship relationship. Like I think Ben's example around having a mentor who is like, you sound like you should do an MD PhD. And he was like, what's that? That is the stuff of a good mentor. And they don't necessarily like they probably shouldn't be like a doctor or or a nurse or someone in like kind of a prototypical medical sort of realm, because like the reality is that medicine is a fifth of our country's GDP, and there are like a ton of different people that work in healthcare that are not a nurse, not a doctor, not a researcher. Like way more people do all these other jobs that are related. And so you can still be in the field and not go to med school. But it takes kind of meeting a lot of people in to get a sense of what other options may be out there, or doing like, internships and kind of things that seem a little bit random. Like medical consulting is a pretty easy way to like learn a lot about how health systems work.
Thank you for that. We also have another question. What are some other ways you would enjoy yourselves through hobbies or etc.? And was studying always time consuming, or were there ways you would organize it so that it wouldn't take up all of your time?
So with the studying thing, I think it comes down to finding a method that works for you and is efficient. So for me in medical school, we talked about some of these resources that we used, like there's a great thing called Boards and Beyond, and it's mostly like short videos that explain concepts. And there's a flashcard app called Anki that has pre-made cards, and you could watch the video and do the cards, and watch the video and do the cards. And then the cards are spaced repetition. And so every day I would set aside, oh, trust me, by the time I got to like ready to take my exams, it was like a couple hours worth of like doing those. But it kind of built up gradually, so it was pretty not that time consuming, I would say. But that was more efficient for me than sitting through my class lectures twice and trying to pick out the information. So things like that. Sketchy had a lot of like drugs and like microbiology stuff was really great. So don't be afraid to go back to the drawing board if something that you're doing isn't working for you. Especially as you move throughout different classes. I had to adapt. The way I studied for anatomy at the beginning of med school was not the way I studied pathology during second year. And it can be kind of frustrating if something that's been working really well for you stops working suddenly and you're like, oh no, what happened? Give yourself a break, go back to the drawing board and find something else that works for you, because the last thing you want to do is spend hours and hours studying in a way that isn't being productive, because then you really feel like you're taking up all of your time and you're not getting anywhere. So that I think is that part. But for like enjoying ourselves in med school, like I just mostly enjoy spending time with like my family and friends. So anytime I could meet up with people, it didn't really matter what we did, walk around the mall, go to the beach, go out to eat or something. That was always really fun for me. Try to exercise as much as possible, but hit or miss on that one.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Kira was saying in terms of like, I'm a huge proponent of find a study method that works for you, because that's the true key. I think for me personally, when I was in college, I was very much a crammer. That does not work for medical school. So don't come into medical school trying to do that. You really just need to take it day by day and stay on top of things, because once you put things off and try to cram for a test, that's when you're sitting there and you're going to be studying for like the week before the exam. You're literally going to be studying 29 hours a day. There's no way to, so it's about like consistent studying. So taking like your hour and a half a day, or however much time that you want to take, and you set aside, you do your studying in that amount of time for that day, and you're consistent about it. And then you save your other time for doing other things. Like for me, I was rock climbing for a while. However, the gyms raised their price, so I've stopped doing that. I'm still mad that they raised the price, but I used to rock climb down at there's a Columbia has a campus on Manhattanville that has a rock climbing gym in it. I really like cooking. And so sometimes my girlfriend and I will have people from my class over and we'll do like little cooking nights. And like I'll meet up with friends of my med school class and we'll play like Super Smash Bros. And like have little tournaments and stuff like that. You know, it's just like you find time with your friends to do like things you like to do together.
And our last question for the night, Promise, can you please share your question?
Is it okay if I ask 2 questions?
Sure.
Sorry. So my first question is, so I'm currently preparing for like the MCAT, and then I don't like what is like a good like steady guide to like in order to like get ready for the MCAT, because I'm trying to like get ready for it like at the end of like when I graduate, so I don't have to like study after I graduate and all of that. And then my second question was, oh, I forgot my second question. Oh, I forgot my second question. Oh yeah. For the, oh, I forgot. I
We can
forgot.
your first question for
Yeah,
now.
I forgot my second question.
I guess one thing I'd just like to mention, because I don't know why I see this all the time. Um, you don't have to take the test if if you're not ready. You know, your practice tests are a good predictor of how you're going to do. And I've seen a lot of people do this, and I don't know why. This was in college and med school. They take the test when they're consistently getting a score that they're not happy with. And a lot of it does come down to a function of studying and preparation and the time you put in. So, I will say, regardless of whatever resources you end up figuring out and using, we put these artificial constraints on ourselves often. Rare is the situation where you need to take this test next week and you can't put it off another month or two. So keep that in mind.
But also, if you are studying and you're getting scores on practice tests that you like, don't put off the test because you're nervous about taking it. That it also happens. And you have to kind of trust the process to a certain extent. But yeah, I mean, studying for all of these kind of sort of benchmark tests ends up being a full-time job for a certain amount of time leading up to it.
Well, that's a wrap on our pre-med panel. Panelists, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us today and share your journey. We really appreciate it.
And a big thank you to Lamia for organizing and coordinating this. If you didn't get your question asked, you can send Lamia a message and she can make sure she finds the answer. In fact, she's working on a manual or a resource for pre-med that will come out in the fall. And so the more questions you ask, the better that manual will be. So again, a big thank you to our panelists for volunteering their time and to Lamia for putting this all together. Thank you all for showing up and asking those great questions. I hope you all, take all your pre-med classes and your philosophy classes and have a lot of fun in college. So thank you again and have a good night.